So let's start by looking at this list of vocabulary. As we go through the PowerPoint, you're going to look for definitions of them. So here they are, alphabetized: age structure, baby boom, demographic transition, demography, developed country, developing country, doubling time, emigration, exponential growth, fertility rate, gross national product, immigration, linear growth, replacement reproduction, standard of living, and ZPG, zero population growth. So these are some of the most important vocabulary in this topic. We're going to be looking for those as we go through the PowerPoint. All right, so yeah, it says chapter 9. For us, it's chapter 6. It's been changed, and I've updated this PowerPoint presentation, but I haven't updated the chapter that it refers to. So some of the questions that you should be able to answer after going through this, just read through those for yourself real quickly. I will add to the last question on there, um, should we slow population growth? There's different viewpoints on that question itself. A couple more. Okay, so here's this question: is the world overpopulated? Um, and we can see that it's likely to increase as we move forward into the future. But there's a debate about this. So some people think we should not only allow the population to continue growing, that we should actually encourage it to continue growing. Usually their argument is based on economics, which may also suggest that our economies are not sustainable. If they require continued growth, is that a sustainable economy? For example, what if instead of buying a new refrigerator every 10 years or however many, the people that you never actually buy your refrigerator, instead you lease it from the manufacturer. So you're paying, I don't know how many dollars a year to use that refrigerator. Now, is it to the manufacturer's benefit to make sure that it keeps running? As opposed to when you buy a refrigerator or a car or any large object, an iPhone, isn't it to the advantage of the manufacturer to sell you a new one as soon as possible? But if they continue to own it and you just lease it from them, now it's to their benefit to keep it working properly. That's an economic incentive for them to keep it going, as opposed to trying to sell you a new one. So it's just a completely different look at economics than what we would normally have, but it might be a more sustainable approach. At any rate, people that think we should have the world continue to the world population continue to grow, usually make an economic argument. People with environmental concerns would argue that we should slow population growth. Um, in fact, we could argue that almost all environmental problems and many social problems are caused by overpopulation. Think about that for a minute. The more people there are, the more habitat we damage, the more pollution we produce, the more sewage we make, the more resources we use, the more crowded our freeways, the more road rage we have. Many negative effects of overpopulation. Okay, so we need to find the assignment for this PowerPoint and download either of the two documents that are there to take notes on. The Word document would probably allow you more space to write. Population notes, I believe so. Yeah.
And would you say that last part?
There's two different versions. There's the original PDF, but I think it might be crowded and not much room to write everything. So you might want to do the Word version instead. Okay. A lot of the growth that we see is occurring in developing countries. As we saw yesterday, the two most populated countries in the world were China and India, with India growing a little faster than China. So we expect India to take the #1 position in terms of population size in the coming decades. So what if we decide that yes, we should slow population growth? There's a couple of different questions that result from that. The biggest one is how? Well, there's two ways to slow population growth. You either increase death, which doesn't sound like a very good choice to me, or you decrease birth. Now, what does that do if we're going to decrease birth? What does that do to people? You're asking people to have smaller families, huh? And that's one of the main freedoms that we think of as the freedom to have as many children as we want, huh? When we want, and so forth. So this is now becoming an ethics question when we talk about should we and how do we, if we say yes, how do we reduce population? Could be an issue to try to figure that out. You may have heard that at one point in time, China enacted what was called the one-child policy. Have you heard about this? Okay, so they passed a law that you can only have one child, each couple only one child. Now, I don't think they enforced it in terms of like, oh, you've had a child, therefore now you have a hysterectomy, which would certainly put an end to having more, right? I think it was more like economic incentives and penalties. So if you had a second child, you would now pay a higher tax rate, or you would be at the bottom of the line when it came to getting new housing, things like this. So people were motivated to reduce the number of kids they had to one. And it was effective at reducing China's population and their growth rate. However, it had some negative impacts too. So one of the negative impacts, really sad, was that many of the families wanted to have boys. And if they had a girl, they would kill her, infanticide. And so there ended up actually today, the boys that have grown up to adulthood now, there's like not a good balance between males and females. It's like instead of 50-50, it's more like 60-40. It's probably not that extreme, but it's enough that there are lots of men in China that don't have wives that would like to. So that was one of the negative impacts, this preference for male children And they would literally, in some cases at least, kill their baby girls so they could have a boy and not have a second child, right? Yeah. So they could have another baby and hope that it was a boy. Yeah.
How long did it last?
The policy lasted for, I believe, a couple of decades, and I think they've taken it away now. So let's look at one of your vocabularies, replacement reproduction. What does that sound like? It's one of these vocabularies that is pretty logical. Replacement reproduction means you have enough children
Or replace?
to replace the parents. Each family only has enough children to replace the parents, which is how many? 2. 1 kid to replace dad, 1 kid to replace mom. That would be replacement reproduction. However, there's another little detail that we got to think about here. And as we're talking about this population issue, we're always talking about births and we're always talking about deaths, because those are the things that balance out the population, right? Not every child is going to survive to adulthood, especially in developing countries where they have high infant mortality rates. And so for them, replacement reproduction might be, on the average, 2.5 kids. In other words, for every 2 families, there are 5 children, because one of them probably won't survive to adulthood, leaving 2 to reproduce in the future. Does that make sense? Here in the US, it's probably like 2.1 is actual replacement. Well, that might be actual zero population growth. These two phrases are closely related. What does zero population growth sound like? Population stable, huh? So ZPG is when the population maintains a constant level because it's at the carrying capacity, because it's at replacement reproduction. And again, it's slightly, excuse me, slightly more than 2 children per family because of infant mortality. Yeah.
Because of what?
Because of infant mortality, because of children dying before they grow up.
For zero population growth?
Zero population growth is when it doesn't grow because they are at replacement reproduction. The culture, or we could look at it for the world as a whole. The country, there's different ways of analyzing populations. And what's the study of different populations? When you're studying a population, what do we call that? What's the vocabulary? It's on there. What term is the science of studying populations and how they change?
Demography?
Yeah, it's demography. So demography is the study of populations and how they change. So for example, when I just did this search for Nevada populations, what pops up right here? Nevada population 2021. What does it say? Demographics. So here they're not only looking at how many people there are in the state. Yes, they do look at that. We might as well have a click. But they also look at the breakdown. How many of these people are males? How many are females? How has the population grown in the past? How many of these people are in different ethnic groups? How many of these people are living at different income levels? All these things are part of demography. And then, of course, selling you things is part of our modern website system, huh? So look how many people there are in Nevada today. So there are some numbers I'm going to want you to memorize, and one of them is the number of people in Nevada, except we're just going to round it off to 3 million. When I moved to Nevada, when I first moved here after college, there were less than 1 million. So you can see by the graph, we have had exponential growth, and the explosion really started in between 1960 and 1980, huh? So like the rest of the world, like Nevada, the rest of the world has grown rapidly. Largely, if you ask why have we had population growth, agriculture and industrial production, I would say especially medical technology, has lowered death rates because we've improved hygiene, so we have less polluted water than we used to have, because water carries diseases in it, huh? I mean, imagine if you lived in New York City in the year 1800 and there's no sewage system. And you just have a well that you're getting your water from, or you're getting your water from the river, right? And somebody down the street has cholera, which is carried in feces, and it gets into the water. So this is why we had some of these outbreaks and epidemics in the past, because of the lack of clean water. Of course, our epidemic currently is airborne, huh? But that would have been a waterborne epidemic, which you could avoid by just drinking clean water, by having good sewage systems, by having good water treatment systems. Easier to deal with than wearing a mask, huh? Basically, we've seen this explosion in population growth because more babies are surviving. They're the ones who are more likely to die of these diseases. So if you lower your infant mortality, you have more adults to reproduce. Does that make sense? So if the infants are living, then they grow to adulthood, and we have more infants living, then we have more adults. So there's more parents in the future. So there's more kids and the population grows. So it's largely a result of improving hygiene and medicine and the impact on the very young, the 5 and under category. Now, sometimes I ask this question, okay, what is the human population? What's happened to the human population over time, and why has that change occurred? And people are always good at saying it's grown rapidly. And then often I have students that respond with, because people have sex more now than they used to. That's not right. People have always had pretty much the same amount. Okay, it's one of our biological features. But what has changed is the number of surviving offspring that we have. Okay, now compare these numbers for developed and developing countries for their growth rates. This is R for a developed country. In other words, a country where most people have access to technology, 0.1%, developing 1.5%. I believe if you scroll down past the definitions, you get to a chart that compares developed and developing countries. And isn't one of those things on there growth rate?
Yeah.
Okay, so there it is.
We write all.
I think all you need to do is 0.1%. Just put in the growth rate for the developed and 1.5% for developing. There should be a chart that's developed versus developing countries.
Yeah. And then first says birth rate and death rate.
Oh, it says birth rate and death rate? Doesn't say, oh, it has R.
Oh,
It's
rate.
This is R, yeah.
Wait, what?
So this is R. This is the growth rate. And
We can't see where you're pointing.
I'm not pointing at it. I'm on the notes page. You know where the vocabulary list is at the top, right? scroll past that and you will find a chart that compares developed and developing countries. Find the row that's labeled R for growth rate, and that's where you fill in the 0.1 and the 1.5. We got it? You okay out there in TV land? Okay, thank you. So you can see the developing countries have a much higher growth rate, 15 times faster than the developed countries. We looked at this just the other day, didn't we? Didn't we just the other day, yesterday, right? We looked at this same thing. Let's keep going. So if we look at humans as just another organism, just another species on Earth, and assume that we are under the same kinds of laws and principles, ecological laws and principles, then we have to start thinking about carrying capacity. We have to think about energy pyramids and how can we meet the needs of people. There's also this question, could we cram twice as many, 3 times as many people on the planet that we have today? Maybe so. But what kind of life would they have? Right? And there's plenty of movies out there that are like exploring these ideas, right? Mad Max. Yeah. So who knows? Or on the other hand, you have Star Trek, where everything it works out beautifully, really, where people become tolerant of one another, and Earth is kind of turned into this beautiful park, and we're out exploring the galaxy, huh? But today we have no way of taking people to other planets and living there. So we are on an island in space, right? We're on this island. And what is the carrying capacity of our island? Becomes this question.
It's like, you know how Elon Musk wants to get people to Mars, right?
Yeah.
And then like they have like ideas of terraforming Mars and stuff like
Right.
that. And like Neil deGrasse Tyson says like, why not just re-terraform Earth if you have the ability? But I'm thinking, yes, it's a good point, because then we have carrying capacity. Could be moving.
Why not do both?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I agree. Settling on Mars would have huge challenges.
Yeah.
First of all, the temperature, the atmosphere, the water, right? All those issues. So,
Totally not.
and there's really interesting movies about that too, right? Like, there was one that was a series recently, and they were like living underground on Mars, so they could avoid the radiation from the sun that is not filtered out by the atmosphere because of the lack of atmosphere. So they could venture out on the surface, but then they'd have to go back down in these giant craters and stuff. Anyway, so I showed you a graph similar to this yesterday, where we have what we know, and then it spreads out where we're making different assumptions in our future predictions, huh? So let's see. Fertility rate, I think, is another vocab that would come in handy right here. Is that on the list, fertility rate? Okay, that is the number of children that the average woman has in her lifetime. So we focus on women because they're the ones who bear the children, and then we don't have to really worry about when couples change, right? When they get divorced and remarry and have kids with a new, right? It's just how many kids did that woman have in her lifetime? So the fertility rates here are based on these different assumptions. So this fertility rate of 2.5 children per woman in her lifetime, down to 1.5 children per woman for her lifetime, right? And we get this kind of range of population growth. If it's only 1.5 children per woman on average for your whole society, in this case it would be for the whole world, then we have this low range of 7.2. You can see that's actually a little less than where we are right now. Do you remember we were like 7.8 or something like that? So we'd actually see a small drop off. On the other hand, up to 10.6 is a possibility if we have this 2.5 children per woman. Yeah.
In the future, do you really think it's gonna grow because women are like getting more educated and like wanting to hold off on having children and having smaller families?
Yeah, this is very true. And we think that this is perhaps the biggest influence on where we will end up is women's empowerment. The more empowered women are, they often choose to have fewer children. And that's why we see the developed countries have that smaller growth rate than the developing countries. Because in developing countries, the women are often less empowered than they are in developed countries. So we actually can base this on data. And as we'll see in a minute, we have a name for this. It's on your list. It's the demographic transition. And we're going to come to that later. But transition is a change. And it's a change in the demographic patterns as the society becomes more developed. And a big part of that is women's empowerment.
Access to contraception.
That's part of it, yeah. And being allowed the access, right?
Just easy access.
Yeah, it's both. And it's not just access to contraception, it's education. For instance, there was an attempt to help this African village reduce their population growth rate because they were headed towards famine. And so this NGO, non-governmental organization, went there and they distributed birth control pills to the women. And they came back a year later. Everybody had just as many kids as before. There was no change. But all the women had this new amulet that they were wearing. They were taking the birth control pills and wearing it like a necklace, thinking that it was a magic that would help them have fewer children. So it's not just giving them birth control, you have to train people how to use it properly. And this leads to this other question, why is there not male birth control? In some ways, it should be easier to develop a male birth control pill because our hormone levels are more steady.
Yeah.
Whereas with women, you have to account for the change every month of their hormone levels.
Then again, with the change coming, does that also mean that it would be harder to potentially get off of that control and everything reverts back to normal?
Oh,
I'm not sure that I understand your question.
Or like,
getting
at
off
least-
birth control?
yeah, once you, for at least a long, I don't know how that would work, but I thought I heard that before was that the problem with having a male birth control was that you have the potential of not being able to
Oh,
get back to your original.
That it would be
state.
irreversible sort of thing?
Yeah.
Oh.
that'd be potential.
Yeah, I don't know if it would be or not. I mean, that's a big issue. Of course, men do have the option of vasectomy,
Yeah,
of
and we
surgical
can
birth
put
control.
that back together, too.
And I think they have mixed success at reversing that, but yeah.
Probably depends for how long you've had it.
Yeah, it could. The advantage of the vasectomy is there is no chemical manipulation, no modification of the hormonal cycles. There's some evidence that men also have hormonal cycles, although it doesn't affect the reproductive system the same way that women's hormonal cycles do, because that hormonal cycle is all focused on preparing the egg for fertilization. So as we know, there's one egg a month, and so you got to get ready for the egg, and then if it doesn't get fertilized, you have to remove it. So that leads to a change in what the hormones are doing. Okay, so you should know this already. Population death, or excuse me, population change is basically births minus deaths, right? We can include in that calculation, to make it a little more precise, immigration, which adds to the population, and emigration, which subtracts from the population.
No, it's not.
If we look at the Earth as a whole, immigration and emigration do not exist, do they? Not until we colonized Mars, right? But if we look at individual countries or regions, then immigration and emigration do exist. Yeah, so if you want to write down definitions for those two, immigration is when people move into an area. Emigration is when they move out from an area. So we just saw Elon Musk and Tesla emigrate from California, right?
Oh, where? I didn't hear about that.
And they immigrated to Texas.
Oh, wait, I did hear about that.
Yeah. So they both happen at the same time. When you leave one place, you go to another place, right? You're exiting one and entering another. So it all depends on the point of view, whether you're an emigrant or an immigrant. One way or another, you're a migrant. You're migrating from point A to point B. Here's a couple of other phrases: crude birth rate and crude death rate. And these are the number of births or deaths per 1,000 people. So that allows us to compare more evenly, make better comparisons between things that might not be equal. Like comparing the strength of an ant to the strength of a human. Have you heard this before? Ants are stronger than people.
Spiders.
And
Spider-Man.
exactly, yeah. So if an ant was the size of a person, it could easily lift up a truck, right? So for their size, they're stronger than people. So we're trying to balance our comparison, and we do that with these crude birth rates and our crude death rates, the number per 1,000. Okay. Here's a look at these crude birth and death rates. Now, this is a little out of date, but it's probably pretty close. It's at least 5 years old. So these numbers, I'm sure, have changed some, but the trends will be the same. So what do you see there when you look at that? What about birth rate to start with? Let's just look at developed versus developing. This is back to the chart again. Jump back down to the chart because it has birth rate and death rate in there, right? Developed versus developing. Who's got a high and who has a low birth rate? You don't have to put the number, just put high or low. Developed is lower than developing.
That rate's higher?
That surprises me too.
Maybe it's just because of larger population.
I'm thinking of older populations.
Just for being more older population.
Just more people making up that older age group. Yeah. Now, certainly in the developing countries, they have higher infant mortality. Is that included on that chart? I don't think it is it? Yeah. Now, here's a comparison of different regions.
Europe is behind the curve.
Europe is, some countries in Europe are getting smaller. Their populations are shrinking. This is also true in Japan.
But it's not anything they put in place, like any sort of legislation.
You can see that Africa has the highest birth rate.
And it's relatively high death rate too.
Yes. We expect regions like Nigeria to explode in population in the future. I think it is common for women to have 5, 6 kids in their family. Yeah.
Say Japan?
Japan, no, Africa. Japan is shrinking. Now, economically, this leads to a problem. If we have a population that's getting smaller because we're having fewer kids, right? Those kids, fewer children means in the future, fewer parents, right? So the population gets smaller. But it also means in the future, fewer workers. So who's going to pay the taxes? Who's going to take care of the elderly?
So what do we do?
Yeah, what do we do?
Well, you'd have to get pretty low to be behind that.
Yeah, but there are concerns about it in Japan and in parts of Europe right now already. There are some economists that are worried about these issues.
If we're like maintaining the same.
Yes, yes.
When.
And this is one reason that some of these same economists are in favor of immigration to keep workers coming in to pay the taxes that pay the social security checks of the elderly people.
Oh, well, maybe we can make it easier for people to migrate.
Yeah, maybe we can make it easier for people to migrate so they can balance out the population in different areas.
Yeah.
Then again, if we were like a super easy to migrate, we probably would end up clumping together in certain areas and
Uh-huh.
entirely.
That's true. A lot of people want to be in the US, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a limit. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know.
It's a really tough question. You know, and you hear about it on the news all the time, right? Just in relation to our country, but it's an issue in other countries. In Europe, the issue is mostly from immigration from the Middle East and Northern Africa. And so now there's also this tension between different religious groups, our immigration tensions here don't tend to have religion as an aspect of any tension, right? But they do in Europe, where we have a lot of Islamic people immigrating to different parts of Western Europe.
Wait, so right now Nigeria is bigger?
Let me see what this is again. This is populations and projections. So yellow is the current population, except this is out of date. And then blue is the future projection.
So do you think right now our deaths are still higher than births in the USA?
How far?
Our deaths are higher than births. Man, you guys are pointing out some things I hadn't noticed, and I'm like, what? How can that be possible? Because the US is growing. Again, I think these are crude rates instead of actual numbers.
2025.
Yeah, these are crude birth rates and death rates, so that makes it a little different.
Okay.
Yeah, from 2006 to 2025. So we're actually closer to the projection than we are to the measurement. So it'd be interesting to see how close these are. But basically, I want you guys to know the big three. And we're going to talk about those in more detail in a minute.
Okay. Is there anything else we have to put in here?
Where are you? In the developing?
Yeah.
Not sure. What else is on there?
It's per capita wage structure.
Yeah, we're gonna, per capita income, just put high and low. What do you think is gonna be high and what's gonna be low?
High and developed.
Yeah. And then we'll talk about age structure in a minute, but you can write it down. We'll just finish. So for developing, put pyramid.
It's all right.
And
if I
age?
Age structure.
Developed and developing, because I kind of wrote all of the wrong ones.
As long as you show me that you've changed them somehow. Retitle them or give an arrow. So for developing countries, the age structure is a pyramid shape. For developed countries, it's more of a column. Although it depends on the country. And then life expectancy, what do you think? Who's got more access to medicine?
Us.
Developed higher life expectancy, developing lower life expectancy. Okay, I believe that if you go past that chart, there is a section for fertility rates. And it asks for 3 different kinds. So the first one is just fertility rate. And that's right here, the average number of children per woman. That's basically the one I gave you before. It's past the chart. Should be a section on fertility rates and 3 different kinds. And then the second one, replacement fertility. And the third one, TFR. Okay. Are we good with this? Did you get the 3 kinds?
No. Oh, wait. No.
All right, so let's go back to this world population clock. And I think you're going to be interested in this. But, and we looked at it yesterday.
I was wondering, that brings an interesting question. Like, we talked about carrying capacities and stuff like that, right?
Uh-huh.
But do you think that just because we are a relatively more intelligent species than others, we're not going to exceed our carrying capacity because we get to a certain point where a lot of places are going to be developed because we're going to have higher populations that we all want to learn, and then that decline in like the amount of children that people bear is going to be less because more people are educated because there's more people. So
It's possible.
It's not that we're going to actually reach a carrying capacity, but a point in which we realize.
We choose to stabilize.
Yeah.
It's possible, and I would hope so. It kind of depends on the choices we make, because there are people that argue for continuing growth in populations. One reason, like I said, is economics. Another reason to continue having population growth is to maintain a strong military presence. So, in fact, there have been countries, and in Europe, Eastern Europe, where it was a little more authoritarian, where women were almost required to have this many kids to increase the number of children they were having. And that was so they'd have kids to be in the army in the future. At any rate, so we looked at this yesterday with the current world population clock growing by the second, right? So let's look at, there's a chart that asks the current populations, right, of the world and of Nevada and of India and China, I believe. Let's fill in that chart. Okay, so at the bottom, we have world population, and let's just call it 7.8 billion. And these are the numbers I want you to remember. 7.8 billion. And for R, we have to go find where the current growth rate is. So let's see. We'll find that in a second. Because right here we have the populations of China, India, and the US. So for China, let's just call it 1.4 billion or 1.5, and India 1.4. Yeah, let's do that. China 1.5 billion. India just slightly behind at 1.4. But if you watch when the numbers change, you'll see the numbers change more rapidly for India. It's growing slightly faster than China is. So we expect the population of India to take over and be ahead of China in the future. Okay? US, what are we going to call that? I guess let's just call it 0.3 billion or 1/3 of a billion. So we've got 1.5 billion, not quite 1.5 billion, and then 1/3 of a billion for the three biggest countries in the world. And if you're interested, I know some of us have relatives in Mexico, for instance. You can see its numbers down here. You can also see that there are only, 14 countries with over 100 million people. Indonesia is number 4. Did you know Indonesia has the world's biggest population of Muslims? We would think it would be Saudi Arabia, right? But the most Muslims in the world are Indonesian because its population is so much bigger than Saudi Arabia, which doesn't even show up in the top 20. Yeah.
Is Mexico developed or developing?
That's a good question. Is China developed or developing? Right? It depends, huh? We see these countries that are making progress from developed to developing. And there are some people who are considering these phrases developed and developing to be already out of date. And that we should modify our language to reflect more accurately this change that's happening. It's not really an either or thing, is it? It's a spectrum. It's a range from one side to the other.
Because I feel like families in Mexico have way more kids than here, but is it migration that our number is so big? Because
well, the US number is so big. I think the US has always been bigger than Mexico. Yeah, and our population growth, some people blame that on immigration. But if you look at the data, immigration obviously adds to our population growth, but it's mostly because our births outnumber our deaths. Yeah. It's like 70% of our growth is from growth within the US, and the other 30% is from immigration.
So through using this chart, you could say that the highest ethnic majority of human beings in the world would be Chinese?
Let's see. I think that's on here. You're asking a demographic question, aren't you? Okay, here's our usual exponential curve, right? And also going up into the future, the possibility of hitting 10 billion people.
Oh,
When is that predicted?
that sounds like way too big of a number.
2080.
Hey, we could make it there, maybe.
Let's go down further. Growth rate. Here's the world's growth rate. So this is R, and it is part of the chart, right?
Yeah.
You put, 7.8 billion for the number of people. R for the world, there it is, 1.05.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah, but that means, remember,
That's the rate for everyone.
this is worldwide, average growth rate of 1.05. And remember, doubling time. 70 divided by that number gives you the number of years it takes to double the population. So 70 divided by 1 is 70. So in approximately 70 years, if nothing changes, we'll have 4 of you and 2 teachers in here. Right? You can think of it at that small of a scale, but in 70 years, the population of the world should double to what, 15 billion in your lifetime, maybe. It's more than doubled in my lifetime. There were like 3 billion when I was born. Okay.
What year were you born?
I was born in 58.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so if we go back here, oh, it doesn't have that year on here, darn it. We might have it elsewhere. Yeah, 3 billion people,
Wait, when did this spike really start to exponentially grow?
like 1800.
1800? It's
Yeah.
like industrial revolution.
Exactly, which for our purposes, I like to refer to this as the industrial medical revolution. Because that's the big impact on
It's crazy to
population
think
growth.
how little people there was at the time.
Oh, yeah, can you imagine Lake Tahoe in 1700?
Well, it's just been like-
In the winter, there were no people here in the winter. The only people that came here were the Paiute people, and the Washoe, I should say, Washoe people, and basically only in the summer. And there were probably only a few hundred of them. Today, there's like 50,000, 100,000 in the summer.
Wait.
The world was probably just so, like, before 1800, it was just so centered into like little towns.
It's so small.
Here's our yearly data. Oh, okay. So I was born right between these two. 3 billion people in 1960.
Oh.
But look at the growth rate, 1.8. And now it's 1.05, huh? Future forecasts. Let's go down a little further. I'm looking for this. Well, you were asking, here you go. So 60% of the world is in Asia. 60% of the world's population is in Asia.
But
17% of the world's population in Africa. Almost 10% in Europe, and so forth. Latin America and the Caribbean versus North America. I always wonder what they choose to do with Central America. Which one do they place it in?
yeah,
I think
so,
if we
but-
see Latin America, then it's probably included here.
Yeah.
If we just see South America and North America, then it's probably included here.
Mhm. But okay, so there's more Asians?
A lot more Asians than anybody else. Absolutely.
Dang,
Yeah, remember it was 1.5 billion Chinese, 1.4 billion Indians. That makes basically 3 billion out of the whole planet.
So wait, and then according to the statistics of prediction,
Yeah, or
how much
20,
bigger
2080.
the populations are gonna be. I think potentially maybe even like Chinese will become an absolute universal language.
It's very possible that the Chinese language might become more dominant than the English language. I mean, English wasn't always dominant, right?
No,
It used to be Latin.
there's still a lot of other Chinese, Japanese, you still see them on like labels.
Yeah,
Spanish
yeah.
and stuff, so.
here's your forecast.
I,
And look how many people living in the cities. This is today.
Wait,
5 billion, almost 5 billion people living in cities today.
oh, in total in cities.
Yes.
Okay. First I thought that was just gonna be like one city in one place.
No.
I was like, wait, what city is that gonna be? So I can avoid it.
Yeah. So population density, just like when we're studying wildlife, is how crowded people are, right? Or how crowded the species is. So this is showing you the most and least crowded regions. California is high on the list in the US, and the eastern US is also quite crowded. And if you looked at that world at night photo that I showed you yesterday, you would see this reflected here. The more people, the more lights. Certainly true in developed regions.
I just sorry. So my grandparents had 8 kids, and the 8 kids, except for my mom, had multiple kids.
Uh-huh.
And so my mom came here and had me, and
Oh.
it's just me. But in
Uh-huh.
Mexico, they had a whole bunch more kids. So does that have to do?
I think so. I think it's a cultural influence,
Yeah.
you know, and here people tend to have fewer children than that, and your mom was probably influenced to
Yeah,
make
'cause
that choice.
She just wanted money and to work and like
Uh-huh,
for herself, not
Yeah.
really focus on children.
yeah. And then there's also religious influences.
Mhm.
And I know Mexico is largely Catholic,
Yes.
which does not approve of using birth control of any form.
Yeah,
really.
yeah. My mom still doesn't approve.
So,
They see it more as like a bad thing or like encouraging to have sex, and it's just,
out of, yeah, as opposed to, I mean, the whole point is the belief that sex should only be for having children.
yeah,
Yeah.
and till marriage.
Well, and then even after, it's only for having children.
Well, yeah.
Okay, and then this is religion. I think we looked at something like this already, right? 30% Christian, 23% Muslim,
That was just
Oh.
worldwide religious.
16% none,
Really? That's
What?
maybe a bit higher than I thought.
15%
Oh.
Hindu.
I thought you said
Worldwide.
But then again, that is quite overwhelming
Buddhist.
amount of people who are.
There's such little Jews. How many Jews?
Yeah. You can't even see it on there, can you?
No, I can
Yeah.
see a little red.
Folk
Yeah.
religions, no.
Folk religions,
What's
like
that?
following, like if you were Navajo and following your Navajo beliefs, right? Or if you're from an African tribe, or if you're from a little tribe in Thailand or something
So
like
would
that.
other just be like the.
Other might be Jainism, if you've heard of that, or it could be, I don't know, maybe I would think that they would include something like Amish in Christians. They would probably include that, but these other religions are just smaller percentages that.
How did Christianity get such a huge influence?
Call it.
Evangelism. Aren't we still sending evangelists out?
Oh yeah.
Right. Some.
I guess there was a lot.
Also, I see that Mormons are not included in here. That might be other religion, or it might be Christian.
Oh.
Because there's so many types.
Yeah.
So,
and
oh,
Catholic?
look, here they're breaking it down into
Oh.
the different types of
Catholic?
Christianity, different types of Islam, different types of Buddhism.
Wait, what? That's where Russia? Mexico isn't? Oh yeah.
Mostly Catholic, yeah. Same for most of South America.
Yeah. And what is United States? Protestant? Oh,
Protestant.
Yeah.
And Protestant is a whole mixture, Baptist, Methodist,
yeah.
all those are different forms of
Like
Protestantism.
Hinduism.
I also didn't know the.
Okay.
South Africa.
Here's where we're going to get R, the yearly change for these countries.
Where would we write that?
So this is in that same chart where we wrote down the populations of India and China and the US. We're going to do it here. This is R for China is let's just call it 0.5. Just so we can remember easily, let's just call it 0.5 for China, call it 1% for India, call it 0.5% for the US.
Do we have
0.5%?
US one?
Yeah, let's just call it 0.5% for the US and for China, and call it 1% for India, just to make the numbers easier to remember.
Yeah.
If you want to know the exact number, you know how to look things up on Google, right?
Yes.
So the problem with that is sometimes you never bother trying to memorize something.
You say 0.5 to the US?
Yeah. So instead of asking you to memorize an exact number, I just want you to have a feel for what it is. Okay? So this is interesting to me, is that the US is actually growing faster than China. Given enough time, we should overpopulate them. But we're way behind though. 1/3 of a billion compared to their 1.5 billion.
That's what's surprising about us also being faster growing as well, because you think way faster.
Yeah. Okay, so which of these countries listed here, of these top 10, do you project is gonna see the biggest change in their populations in the future?
China.
Out of all 10, which is gonna have the biggest change in population in the future?
If you say- we know they're growing faster now, but it's changed.
No, just look at R, the yearly change.
Oh, wait, what is that? Oh, is that 7? No. 1 point. Mexico and Bangladesh.
Indonesia?
Wait, 2? Nigeria.
I don't know.
Nigeria is the most.
2.58.
Nigeria.
Every year, percentage growth, remember the rule of 70. Which country's gonna double the fastest is the one that has the highest. If we took 70 divided by 2.58, they should double in 27 years.
Oh my god.
Uh-huh, just 27 years, twice as many people in Nigeria. They would jump ahead of us, right? Are you with me on that?
That's kind of scary.
So it's possible that Nigeria is gonna take position number 3 in just a couple of decades.
I think it'll also maybe peter off too. Or not.
I kind of have a problem with that phrase, by the way.
Peter off?
No.
No.
So, because that's my name.
Oh.
There's like
Um,
exponential-
It's very possible that they could flatten out,
That's
right?
like
But
China.
again, it's gonna depend on so many cultural factors and medical factors, women's empowerment being the biggest issue. Right? And what do we see happening in Nigeria that you hear about in the news? Have you heard of this Islamic group Boko Haram in Nigeria? Who will go into like a middle school or a high school and abduct 100 girls at a time and take them off into the jungle and basically force them to become wives of all of their warriors.
Oh my
It's like
god.
build their woman
Yeah.
that way.
Sorry?
They like build their that way or something.
That's part of it, yeah.
Oh my
Uh-huh.
god.
So it's like combined terrorism and imposing their will on other people and increasing their numbers by having these 15-year-olds have babies. Yeah, so there's all kinds of influences.
Oh my god, that's so scary.
Yeah, Boko Haram is pretty
Wait,
scary.
Barely. Isn't there like a genocide going on in China right now?
Yes, I don't think the Chinese would want us to refer to it as a genocide, but looking from the outside, it has characteristics of a genocide. I'm trying to be gentle in my language. And it's of a Muslim minority called the Uyghur people. Yeah, and so, you
So
know,
are
it's not about Muslim being good or bad. In
No.
one place, they're being attacked. In another place, they're doing the attacking, huh?
Mhm. So, are those Muslims citizens of China?
Yes,
Okay.
but traditionally, they were a separate ethnic group and would have had their own country, really.
Yeah.
Kind of like Tibet, if you know the history of Tibet, of the Buddhists in the high mountains of the Himalayas, and how China invaded Tibet. It was its own country.
Yeah.
And this was in the mid-50s. And China has held on to Tibet ever since.
So, that would also make their population decline.
Yes, it would. It would drop the
Because there's-
population of the Uyghur people. Uh-huh.
I've heard that they're trying to
To the Uyghurs? I can't give you any details.
Yeah.
It's
because
one of
they're
those news
touching-
stories that I hear the headlines, but I don't always read the article itself, you know what I mean? It's more like when something really bad happens, it hits the news, but it's ongoing.
and it's like just consistent.
Yeah, but they've
Yeah.
also China's like done a good job of like keeping it in China.
Keeping it quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What they do best.
Yeah.
It seems like.
Let's see. What else is on there, you guys, on the chart?
Oh, we never said how many
For Nevada, do we need Nevada?
I did Nevada,
And Washoe.
but Washoe County.
Okay,
Well, you also need the percentage.
so we need Nevada.
Nevada's just 3 million.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're just gonna call that 3 million. Here's our growth rate. Look at, this is 1870. So why did Nevada's growth rate, sorry, I think it's loading ads here, so everything's jumping around. Why was the growth rate 20% in 1870? Yes, because there was nobody here, but then they discovered gold and
Yeah.
silver. And so we had the gold rush, and that's why we see that huge jump in population. Well, huge jump in the growth rate then. So today's growth rate for Nevada, let's just call it 1.5%. It's the third fastest growing state in the nation. And that's including immigration. And immigration in this case includes immigration from California and from Texas and from New York, right? If you're outside of Nevada and you move to Nevada, then you're an immigrant, as I was when I came here in the 80s. Oh, that's a good question. I'm gonna let you look it up and tell us. Like, use the word rank. So, we got the growth rate. What do we need? We need, oh, what is this? Here it is, Nevada population rank. It's right there. That's,
30.
that's density. This is saying we are the 33rd most.
Wait, but it showed up into 2021.
We're the third fastest growing, but it looks like we have the 33rd biggest population. It's most of the growth in Nevada is occurring in Vegas. So we're 3 million now. When I moved here, we're less than 1 million. I remember it being big news when we hit 1 million, and most of that growth was in Vegas and still is.
Mhm.
So we're going to look for Washoe County now, right? Where is it? I thought I just passed it. Here's the breakdown of ethnicities, if you're interested.
Are Latinos part of another race?
Usually Latinos are included as one of the categories. One thing that I often see though is that some Latinos associate with being white and some Latinos associate with being black and some with pure Latino. And so there's this overlap with the mixed ethnicity groups. That seems really strange that they wouldn't have put Latino on there. I apologize for that. That makes me question this whole webpage.
Me too.
Okay, this is what I'm looking for. Okay, so this is the county of that has Las Vegas, Clark County. And look at their population, 2.3 out of the 3.1 are all down here in southernmost Nevada, right?
Collapse at that point.
2.3 out of the 3.1 million, all down there. So all I have to do is hover over and we get Washoe. So Washoe, 485,000, just round it off, 500,000, 500,000. Now realize this does not include Carson City or Douglas County, so we might as well round up at that point, huh?
That's bigger than I thought.
Growth since 2010 is 15%, so how could we take that and turn it into an R value for a single year? Because this is an R value for 10 years. So what are we going to do to figure out the average growth rate over the last 10 years is just divide by 10. So for Washoe R, 1.5%. Now let's compare that to Vegas. Clark County since 2010 has grown by 20%. Divide by 10, their R is now 2%. Okay? Does that take care of that whole chart?
Yeah.
So
Oh,
percentage of
except-
Washoe is 2.
Washoe was 15%, but we divided by 10 because it was for 10 years. So it was a 1.5% R.
What was R for the world?
R for the world, let's go back to the world population clock.
1.05, right?
And that sounds correct.
How much?
1.05.
Yeah, 1.05.
Okay.
So you see that it's mostly just between 1 and 2, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it makes a big difference whether you double in 70 years or 35 years, right?
If there was like some sort of, let's say that we had nuclear fallout and people still grow at the same rate that we are now, or would that probably go back up?
Okay, so you're asking if we have a nuclear war and we have a big, huge drop in population, what would be the influence on the R? I think there's going to be a couple factors. One is how much food is available. If there's plenty of food, I would expect that people would choose to reproduce faster.
Mm-hmm.
If there's not very much food, they might not. And it is kind of an interesting balance because what do we need to raise food? We need people out planting the crops and harvesting the crops. And one of the reasons we've seen these large population growths in the past is because we need people, we need bodies to grow food. And the more kids you have, the more workers you have on your farm, right? So that was one of the influences to have larger families. Another influence for having larger families was basically retirement. Who's going to take care of you when you're older? Right? So you have a bigger family in the hopes that at least one of those kids will take care of you.
Oh, I see.
Okay, back to the actual PowerPoint. I hope everything's going okay out there at home. So the fertility rate has been dropping. And you can see that it's dropping more in the developed countries than in the developing countries. Again, replacement fertility is 2, but is it really? If we actually were at a replacement fertility of 2 children per woman, 2.0, we would still see the population grow for a little while at least. One is because of something called population momentum. So here, let's say we're at 2.3, 2.2, 2.1. We hit 2.0 right here, huh? What about all the babies that were born in the previous years that are approaching adulthood still? And they're going to have kids in the future, right? So when we're looking at these projections for the future, we always have to think about the children, the pre-reproductive age group, and how many of them that there are. Okay, I'm guessing that this PowerPoint was made in 2006 or 2007 because they keep referring to that year. But just during that 1 year, 3 million people were added to the US, with the majority of it because births were more than deaths. Yes, immigration played a role, but not as much as births over deaths. That's a large number. Again, this is 2006, so I'm not sure what it is now.
That's probably less now
Yeah.
because it's made it harder to get in.
Yeah. Okay. So let's look at this graph and this vocabulary. In fact, is this a vocabulary at the start of the paper, the baby boom?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So look at the graph. What's happening to the number of births per woman during the baby boom? Went up, right? Okay. And so that's why they refer to some people as boomers. And I am a boomer. kind of towards the end of the baby boom. But the baby boom, where I see students get confused about this, is they think it's a worldwide event, and it's not really. It's pretty much limited to the US. Yeah. So I want you to keep that in mind, that it's mostly in the US.
It would make sense that way because, I mean, it really depends on who was a lot more successful.
Yeah. So I would define the baby boom as an increase in fertility, or you could say population, but really it's fertility that we're talking about, which resulted in an increase in population. An increase in fertility after World War II in the United States. And then there's a little echo of the baby boom, where it doesn't show it on here, I don't think, but sometimes some of these graphs you can see another little bump because the boomers had kids, right? And that might be you guys.
Oh.
Are your parents boomers?
My dad is just barely making it.
Yeah, okay. So,
So I'm half boomer.
man, you guys are making me feel old.
Half
When your parents aren't even boomers, oh my God.
I think my mom was born in 73.
Oh yeah, she wouldn't be a boomer then.
Yeah.
And here's a little more, expanding the graph outward, right, in both directions. Actually, there was something else I wanted to say about this. Notice that the birth rate was high here at the turn of the century, the fertility rate. And then it dropped, and this is associated with increasing industry, people moving to the cities and leaving the farms behind. And we were starting to get some more women's empowerment at that time as well,
Oh, yeah.
with the women's suffrage movement.
Suffragettes.
So what do we have here? This is now births per thousand. So we're not looking at fertility rates, we're looking at birth rate. And we're seeing a drop here during the Depression. And then it climbed, fell during World War II, and then exploded afterwards, huh?
Jeez.
And then we have what they called the baby bust,
That they
followed by the echo of the baby boom. And there were people a year ago were saying, wow, if we're going to be locked up for months because of this pandemic, we're going to see another baby boom. And it turned out to be the opposite, that we're seeing another baby bust because people
Yeah.
chose not to have kids because they weren't sure about what their job prospects would be and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Is that like a good thing?
It depends on if you think that the population should get smaller or bigger.
What do you think?
Well, I'm an environmentalist. So if you ever ask me my opinion, just think, what's the best thing for the environment?
Smaller. I think so too.
Okay. I believe this is, oh, okay. I think this is the US. I can't tell, but 1900 versus the year 2000. Life expectancy, what's happened?
Oh.
The number of women working outside the home. The number of people graduating high school. The number of homes with flush toilets. 1900 is yellow, 2000 is blue.
That's crazy.
The number of homes with electricity. Look at the changes we've had. How many of these do you want to back up from where we were? Oh, but look at that one. I want to back that one up.
Well, that's also because there's way more people than people.
No, it's not because there's way more people, because it's accounting for that. Homicides per 100,000.
Oh, for each one.
Yeah. There's almost 5 times as many homicides
Just more
out of every
people.
100,000 people now than there was in 1900.
That's-
How about your
It'd be the other way around.
how about your hourly pay?
Yeah, I'd be pissed.
And what have people done? They've left the cities and they've moved to the suburbs. Huh?
Well, how much was $3 back in?
How much what? I don't know. But
Probably somewhere.
this has been adjusted for inflation.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
So that's real
So
bad.
that's real growth. Yeah. Think about, the Great Gatsby kind of era, right? Okay. So, there was a section about fertility rate, correct? And there was the 3 kinds, and then there was 9 impacts on fertility rate, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 9 factors that influence fertility rate. So here's half a dozen of them. So we're filling in the 9 factors that influence fertility rate on the notes. So we would expect that if it's more expensive to raise and educate children, that fertility rate would drop, right? What about availability of pensions? If there's pensions available for people to retire on to make a living after they're done working, wouldn't that tend to drop fertility rate also? Yeah, I believe that there's going to be 3 on the next page. The tendency when people move to cities is to have fewer kids, partly like I was saying about needing people to work the fields if you're in a rural environment. When women have education and employment opportunities, they often delay having children and spread them out more. The number of infant deaths has the opposite influence. If we have high infant mortality, it's more likely that women will have more kids because they're afraid they might lose one of them. And so they'll have another kid just in case. But then they end up with 3 or 5 is also a possibility, huh? If they don't lose any of their children. Marriage age. If people get married at age 20, they're probably going to have more children than if they get married at age 30.
I want to get married at so.
And think about it this way. Let's compare a family that their tradition is to get married at the age of 20 and have kids. Just if they had 1 kid, and that always happened every 20 years, they'd have more kids than if they waited until they were 33. Because there would be 5 marriages during the 20-year period over a century, but only 3 marriages over the 33-year period over a century. Are you with me? So by delaying marriage, you tend to have fewer kids. I guess availability of contraception and abortion is a pretty obvious impact on fertility rate. Oh, that didn't have 9? Okay. Leave it at 6 then. It is what it is. I guess there's not 9 on the list. We're just going to leave the 3 there. Meanwhile, we see death rates declining because of more food, better medicine, better sanitation. This is what I was talking about. Having a sewage system and clean water supplies really has increased our life expectancy and reduced our death rate. Oh, there it is. Safe water supply kind of fits in there. U.S. infant mortality is higher than it could be. We were ranked 46th in the world when this PowerPoint was made.
And now we're what?
That would be 46th highest infant mortality rate out of about 150 countries in the United States, which is not something that most Americans would think would be that high here. Huh? We'd think we'd be like the lowest of all infant mortality, but we're number 46. And here's 3 reasons that they're explaining our high infant mortality rate: a lack of care for both before and after birth, especially for poor people, drug addiction, and a high teenage birth rate. teenage mothers are more likely to lose their baby than older women are.
Is it
Their
because
bodies haven't quite developed completely
Oh.
enough to completely nurture that child yet.
I didn't know that.
There's also an influence of being able to, even if they have a healthy birth, there's the influence of being able to take care of it for the next 5 or 10 years,
Yeah.
which can be hard if you dropped out of school and don't have a good job. And yeah.
So
Malnourished
scary.
child.
Yeah. Here's a graph showing immigration in the U.S. since 1820, and I just want to point out that now when we hear the word immigrants, we mostly think of people from Central America, right? From Mexico and Latin America. But remember, 1820, these were the Irish, these were the Italians, these were the Germans that were immigrating to America, right? And in 1907, 1914, we had a big immigration argument also, where they passed a bunch of laws to restrict immigration, which was mostly from Europeans at the time. So it's one of those things that seems to come around in cycles, huh?
Mhm.
And I just like to also keep in mind that the only people who are not immigrants to this country are Native American people, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
And the family picture that they put up. Oh my god.
okay. I'm not gonna go here, I'm just gonna move on, but these are just things to think about, right? Where do you stand on these things? Okay. How are we doing? Age structure, I think that was one of your definitions.
Yeah.
So age structure is the number of people in different age groups in a population. And when we look at age structures, this allows us to predict future population growth. The more young people there are under age 15, the more we expect the population to grow in the future, because they will be the future parents. So I'll just give you a heads up right now. I'll be asking some questions about these age structure diagrams, and I'll ask you to make a future prediction, and people usually do great at that because they've memorized which shape means what. But then I ask to explain your prediction, and you need to tell me about the number of young people and the number of future parents in order to explain that prediction. If we don't have very many young people, then how many fewer parents then how many future parents do we have? Right? And therefore the population would decrease, right? If we have a lot of young people, then we have a lot of future parents, and therefore,
Increase.
yeah, just keep the whole chain of logic in your explanation. Okay, so this is on your paper. So it's like page 4 or something like that. These are age structure diagrams. And what they do is, on the left, it's a sideways bar graph. And on one side, the left in this case, they have males, and on the other side, on the right, they have females. And the first thing that it asks you to do on your notes is label the 3 age groups. So you need to label that the blue part is pre-reproductive. These are the children that are not reproducing yet. The pre-reproductive group, which is the most important group to look at in comparison to the others when predicting the future.
So you have to put that,
Yeah, you have to label.
just that part?
Well, there's a couple things to do here. The first thing it asks you to do is to label the 3 age groups, right?
That's because it's a little hard.
Yeah.
Um,
What I would do for you is insert a text box, yeah, and then you can drag it where you want it to be.
okay.
So the blue part, pre-reproductive, yellow part, the reproductive ages, and the orange part, post-reproductive ages. And so earlier, when we compared developed versus developing, I asked you to put pyramid and column. And the pyramid is the one that's over here on the slide in the far left.
Can I take a picture?
Yeah. And the column would be this stable one. The US is actually in between those two, slowly growing. But what I'd like you to visualize is a child that is born today, they're born down here at the bottom, aren't they? 0 years old. And then they gradually work their way up. They're 5 years old, 10 years old, 15, 20, 25, right? They work their way up, whatever shape it is. As they get older, they move up the graph, don't they?
Oh, it's,
Right? You guys are just leaving the blue and entering the yellow, correct? Yes. And the way you do that is by visualizing the movement of the bars upward. So here's the babies in Nigeria, this many babies compared to the rest of the population. What happens when they all move up into the yellow? How wide is the yellow now? It's wider now. So we have more parents in the future, which means we'll have more babies in the future. That's why this is growing rapidly, because we have so many young people that will be future parents. That's why this one is stable, because the number of young people is about the same width as the adults are already, huh? So they're going to replace their parents with about the same number of them as there already were. So that's a stable population. Why is this one declining?
Because there's less young people.
Not very many young people, therefore
Less future.
less future parents. So even fewer. Now, the other thing that is actually visible on all the graphs, but it's most obvious on this one on the far right, look at the very top of the graph and compare the number of males and females. What's going on there?
Or that one? Or the clinic?
It's most obvious here, but it's here and maybe there also.
Oh,
But it's most obvious there. What do we see?
females are more.
And what age group is this?
45.
These are the very oldest people, huh?
Yeah.
Women have a longer life expectancy than men, correct?
Yeah.
And it shows up on this graph as being a little out of balance at the top, because women tend to live longer than men do. Here's comparisons of the age structures of developed versus developing countries. Look at the difference. And this is also showing how many total people there are across the bottom. So if a third of the people are less than 15 years old, doesn't that mean we have a lot of future parents coming up in the developing countries? Here's another way to look at it. Here's 1955, when the baby boomers were first born. So here's the baby boomers born in yellow. Here are their young parents. here they've retired, and here they're the elderly. So they're moving up the pyramid. So this is one age group, right? Showing them every 30 years.
That makes a lot more sense.
As they move
The
at-
progression and how it moves behind.
Right, and these are the children of the boomers, right?
Yeah, no.
And now we have grandchildren, and maybe some great-grandchildren over here if it's 30 years apart. I think, I don't know if you guys ever watched Saturday Night Live, but they had a little skit about the baby boomers. It was pretty funny. It was actually a rap that they did. That was just like last week, I think. About them dominating the demand for goods and services. It looks like that bottom sentence is not correct. Need some kind of spell check going on there.
Well, again, may help from.
That might be global aging.
What's that mean?
I'm thinking that as we have more older people, global aging, as more of the population, basically what's happening is we have better medicine, so people are living longer, huh? So we have a growing population of the elderly, especially in a developed country like here, right? And us old people need you young people to take care of us, right? So do we want to send you off to war?
At first I thought it was just like people become more or less, or just because they're just gonna be like old and tired.
Yeah, they're more relaxed. Yeah.
Like, well, I didn't think it was that worse, but.
Yeah. So here's the changes in the age groups. The red, this is time, and this is what, the United States or world? I think it's world. Here's time, and the percentage of these age groups. Here's the young people are dropping, so we would expect to see the population slow down. Although this is 2150, it's projecting way out in the future, isn't it? Here we are today. Old people growing. Okay, thanks for your time. I hope you guys have a good holiday. Be safe.
Bye, thank you, Mr. Fairley.
Bye. Oh, wait, one more thing. Please read 2 chapters. The chapter, I forget what numbers they are. It's on Teams. I want you to read the chapter about garbage and the chapter about agriculture. Okay?
Should we take notes?
No, just read them for now.
Okay, I have another question. Are we supposed to turn in the PowerPoint notes for today?
I don't think we finished, did we?
Yeah, I don't think so.
So let's finish and then you'll turn them in, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Then thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. You guys had good questions today.
It was quite interesting.
Made me fall behind on my plan, but it's better to be involved. Do you have any paper?
No.
Okay.
But it's always weird looking at the, like, global population,
It's crazy.
the active one, just because
Yeah.
when you look at it, and you're like, oh, they're individual lives, and just how sporadically and quick
Yeah.
they're just going, and
Right.
it's like,
Like fireworks going off.
yeah, it just like makes it seem very insignificant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't entirely wrong.
Not
There are a
entirely.
lot of things we are quite insignificant.